Throw that bastard in jail. He should never be forgiven. The headline stretched across the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune, bold and brutal. Underneath it was a photo of Marcus James, face half-shadowed, hands cuffed, being escorted out of the courthouse. His head was tilted slightly, his neck strained, eyes unfocused under the relentless flash of cameras. Behind him, the crowd outside the court hissed and shouted, some raising phones, others just glaring. Lila stood still on the sidewalk, gripping the paper, unsure if she was holding justice or watching her brother be buried alive in public shame. The events that led there began on a night that cracked the sidewalks and silenced the streets. It was February, and South Chicago had gone still under a biting wind. At a small, family-run gas station on 83rd Street, Wallace Greer, age 51, father of two, was shot once in the chest during what appeared to be a robbery. Police arrived to find a register open, no cash inside, and Wallace already dead. No fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing to follow but smoke. 48 hours later, the city had a suspect. Marcus James, black, 22, with a couple of traffic citations and a misdemeanor for disturbing the peace, was arrested at his apartment without incident. The officers didn't explain much to Lila or their mother. They just said, "We have him." On the news that night, Marcus's face was already on screen beside words like dangerous and armed. It was as if the city had been waiting for someone like him to mess up. The evidence wasn't concrete. The main piece was a surveillance video from the station. A tall man in a hoodie running away at 2:14 a.m. The footage was dark, grainy, and the man's face was obscured by the hood. The vehicle he entered had no visible license plate. Police said the man's height and build matched Marcus. They said he had no alibi. They didn't mention that no one had asked him where he was at that time. Then came the witness. Kendra Miles, a resident who lived 2 blocks from the gas station, claimed she'd seen Marcus in the area around the time of the murder. Her statement was vague. "I think I saw him" became "I'm almost sure," which became "yes, that's him" by the time it reached court. No one asked if she had any personal issue with Marcus. No one checked if she'd been drinking that night. She pointed, and that was enough. The trial came fast. Too fast. Within 3 weeks of the arrest, Marcus was standing before a judge. Lila barely had time to breathe, let alone understand what was happening. Marcus was given a public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The judge was familiar with the prosecutor. Too familiar. The jury was entirely white. No one called it racism. They called it coincidence. Lila watched from the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched in her lap. She knew things were off from the start. The defense didn't question the integrity of the video, didn't challenge Kendra's testimony, didn't call an expert to analyze the footage. No alternative suspects were suggested. In his final argument, Marcus's lawyer said, "My client has had problems, but this case has too many gaps." His tone said he'd already lost. The prosecutor didn't need much. He spun a story. An unemployed man, desperate for cash, impulsive, reckless. He knew Wallace would be working alone. He had a weapon. He needed money. And now here he sits. The jury nodded before he was even done. The verdict was unanimous. On the day of sentencing, Lila sat like stone. Her mother stayed home, afraid she'd scream in court. Marcus looked like he was made of iron, still unbroken but fading. When the judge said 20 years in prison, parole possible after 17, he didn't flinch. Lila didn't hear the gavel. She only heard someone behind her mutter, "Should have been life." Outside, a reporter shoved a microphone in her face. "How does it feel, knowing your brother was sentenced for murder?" Lila blinked once, then said, "He didn't do it." The reporter gave a crooked smile. "Everyone says that," he replied, already turning away. It poured on the day Marcus was moved to Joliet. Lila watched the prison van disappear down the soaked asphalt, its tires leaving deep ruts in the mud. She didn't speak. Neither did her mother. People they used to call friends had stopped coming by. The silence around their home wasn't emptiness. It was rejection. They weren't welcome anymore. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Doors closed just a little too quickly. The people Marcus used to help, changing tires, lending tools, now whisper behind curtains. To them, Marcus had become proof of what they always suspected, that he would end up exactly here, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. Lila felt that weight every day. The mailbox was constantly dented. A slur was scratched into their back fence one morning. The police said it was probably kids. They didn't investigate. When she spoke, people looked past her as if grief had made her invisible. It took her 6 months to visit Marcus. She tried writing letters, but couldn't finish any. The words never sounded right. She carried a half-written one in her jacket, folded so many times the creases looked permanent. The prison visitation room was cold and quiet. Marcus looked older. His stubble was uneven, and his shoulders had shrunk under the weight of time. He picked up the receiver on his side of the glass. His voice cracked from disuse. "Do you still believe me?" he asked, not daring to smile. Lila nodded slowly, then said, "They took your voice, but they can't take the truth. I'll get it back." He breathed in deeply, closing his eyes for a second. "As long as you believe, I can breathe in here," he said. She pressed her palm to the glass, and for the first time in months, "So did he?" When the court handed down Marcus James' sentence in the winter of 2015, the system breathed a sigh of relief. Case closed, files locked, a name removed from the streets. No one questioned why it took only a distorted video clip and a shaky witness to condemn a man 2 decades behind bars. But Lila James didn't see closure. She saw a mistake too neatly wrapped. 3 years later, she was sitting in the back room of a university library, surrounded by court documents, photocopied reports, and unanswered questions. Her brother's name was buried under red tape and legal indifference, but she read every page like scripture. When she reached out to Thomas Avery, a former criminal defense attorney, now living in quiet retreat, she didn't expect much. He opened the file, read for a full hour in silence, and finally muttered, "Let's see if the truth has a pulse." They started with the video. It was grainy, jittery, clipped. The timestamp skipped, frames froze. Thomas suspected tampering, but without the original, it was speculation. Lila tracked down Eric Sloan, a technician who once serviced the station's security systems. After some hesitation, Eric pulled an old hard drive from his garage shelf. "I didn't trust what happened back then," he said. "I kept a copy." They brought the drive to Max Rohn, a trusted forensics expert. Max confirmed their suspicion. "This version's 14 seconds longer than the one used in court," he said. "And there's someone else in it. In that missing fragment, a second man exited through the back, shorter than Marcus, wearing a leather jacket, limping, with a large duffel bag in his hand. He vanished into the alley where no cameras could follow. He was never mentioned in court, never pursued. Thomas filed for retrial. It was denied. The court claimed the footage didn't meet the threshold for new evidence. Lila slammed her fist on the desk, but Thomas only said, "They don't want shadows. They want names." That's when they started digging into known gangs in the area. One name surfaced again, and again, Iron Veins. Within months, they located David Rooker, a former member turned mentor at a youth rehab center. When shown the video, Rooker went pale. "That limp," he said, "that's Reggie Vaughn, Gator. He disappeared after shooting on the south side, a few weeks after your brother went down." He handed them an old address and a nickname. Records showed that Vaughn had been flagged early in the investigation and scrubbed from follow-ups. Thomas suspected internal cover-up. Alvin Reyes, a forensic science student assisting their team, found that Vaughn's parole data was edited from within the Cook County system. The logs showed he was under house arrest, but no location was recorded the night of the murder. "That kind of hold doesn't happen unless someone digs it," Alvin said. They re-examined the testimony that sealed Marcus's fate. Kendra Miles, the only witness, had vanished from public records. Through medical databases, they found her at a psychiatric rehabilitation center. In a signed statement, she confessed, "I was scared. The officer told me to look at the photo and say yes. I never saw his face clearly. They submitted a second petition. Again denied. This time the court cited Kendra's mental instability and lack of new material significance. Thomas stared blankly, lit a cigarette, and muttered, "We need someone who is inside the system, but no longer answers to it." That led them to Linda Park. Linda, a former internal affairs investigator with the Chicago PD, agreed to review the evidence. She found an overlooked name in a logbook. Freddie Watts, a delivery driver who had been at the gas station at 1:57 a.m. He had never been called to testify. "I was there," Freddie said. Wallace was alive. No one else was around. I tried to give a statement. They told me they already had their guy. With Freddie's testimony recorded and notarized, Thomas prepared a third petition. This time, the court accepted. A hearing was set. Marcus James would be removed from his cell and returned to a courtroom, not as a criminal, but as someone asking to be heard again. The courtroom was smaller than Lila remembered, less public, less formal, but no less tense. Marcus was brought in wearing plain clothes, not prison-issued orange. He looked older, quieter, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Recognition that this was a rare chance, and maybe his last. The judge listened as Thomas laid out the motion. New video, previously unexamined witnesses, evidence of tampering and perjury by omission. When the prosecutor dismissed the claims as desperate, Thomas stepped forward. If desperation were a crime, the state would be on trial. He called Max Roan first. Max showed both video versions side by side. "There's clear inconsistency," he explained. "One has been cropped. The longer file contains a second individual." The courtroom murmured. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor objected. Overruled. Next came Linda Park. She testified about the parole record alteration and missing witness logs. She described Freddie Watts' timeline and how it contradicted the police's established narrative. There was someone else. There always was. You just didn't look. Then came the moment that cracked the silence. Kendra Miles, escorted and under medical supervision, stood with trembling hands and read her retraction. I was scared. I said what they wanted, but I never saw Marcus's face that night. She looked at him across the courtroom. "I'm sorry." The prosecutor tried to dismantle her statement, but Thomas interrupted. "Your Honor, we've proven that someone else was there, that a key witness was coached, that files were altered, and that the original evidence was incomplete by design. If that doesn't warrant another trial, what does?" The judge didn't answer right away. The room held its breath. He stood, paced briefly, then returned to his bench. Given the accumulation of inconsistencies, procedural neglect, and substantial doubt raised, this court grants a motion. A retrial will proceed. Lila gasped. Marcus closed his eyes. He didn't smile. Not yet. Thomas simply nodded. It wasn't over. But for the first time in 3 years, the law had stopped closing doors and started opening them. The courtroom was silent, suffocating under the weight of what was about to unfold. No one spoke. Only the soft rustling of documents and the faint tapping of leather shoes echoed off the cold marble floor. After nearly 7 years of incarceration, Marcus James, once convicted of a crime he did not commit, stood once again before a judge, this time not as a defendant, but as a man asking the world to finally look closer. The air felt heavy, as if the very room understood the stakes. This wasn't just a retrial, it was reckoning. Lila James sat in the front row. Her fingers laced so tightly they turned pale. She had spent the last 3 years gathering evidence, tracing old leads, watching hundreds of hours of surveillance footage no one had bothered to review the first time. Her sleepless nights had produced more than just paper trails. They had uncovered truths hidden in silence. But one mistake, one hesitation today, and all of it could unravel in front of her eyes. When the new surveillance footage played before the court, the room froze. The added 14 seconds were damning, not to Marcus, but to the original investigation. The man in the video had a limp, a leather jacket, and a large bag slung over his shoulder. He exited the gas station through a rear door, his face partially visible under a street lamp. It wasn't Marcus. Not even close. The judge leaned forward, staring at the screen for a long time, his hand steepled under his chin. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. Combined with the recanted testimony of Kendra Miles and the new sworn statement from Freddie Watts, the delivery driver who had been ignored, the case was falling apart. Piece by piece, the narrative that once condemned Marcus collapsed under the weight of truth. Finally, the gavel struck, echoing like thunder in the chamber. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. This court hereby vacates the conviction of Marcus James. The defendant is to be released immediately. A breath, relieved, broken, trembling, rippled through the room. Lila let out a choked sob and rushed forward, embracing her brother in front of a courtroom that had once stolen him from her. Marcus didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around Lila, holding her with a quiet strength that had survived 7 years behind bars. Tears streamed down his face, but his expression wasn't joy. It was release. It was grief finally allowed to surface. For a man who had spent nearly a decade silenced, this was the first time the world had listened. Walking out of the prison gates wasn't the moment Marcus had imagined all those years. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even joy. It was disorienting. The world had moved on, reshaped itself while he remained frozen in time, stuck in a cell that became a second skin. He had lost everything. His youth, his job, his reputation. But the deepest wound wasn't any of those. It was the loss of faith in people. Not just the prosecutors or the cops. It was the neighbors who looked away, the friends who never asked questions, the silence of those who should have known better. In the early years of his sentence, that silence fed a quiet rage inside him. But Lila's letters, faithfully delivered every single week, had been a tether that held him back from breaking. 1 month after his release, Marcus left Chicago. He boarded a bus heading south, away from the headlines and away from the ghosts. He arrived at a monastery on the outskirts of New Orleans, a quiet place nestled between moss-covered oaks and bell towers. As a child, he had once spent a summer camp there. Now, it felt like the only place untouched by everything that had come after. He slept in silence, woke before dawn, cleaned the floors, read in the chapel. At first, it was just to breathe, but something else began to stir. In the stillness of that place, Marcus found a strange kind of peace. Not in forgetting, but in remembering without fury. And then one morning, an elderly priest asked him gently, "Have you ever thought about forgiveness?" Marcus didn't answer for days. He didn't know if he could. But on a quiet Sunday, he stood in front of a small congregation and told his story. Not in anger, not in pain, just truth. He spoke of a system that failed, of a sister who refused to give up, and of finding hope in places he never expected. He wasn't there to preach about God. He was there to remind people what happens when justice becomes routine. His words struck something in the people who listened. Former inmates, teenagers on probation, tired men who'd lost too much. And for the first time since his arrest, Marcus saw something different in their eyes. Not pity, not fear, recognition. Marcus decided to stay. He enrolled in a theological seminary connected to the monastery, not to become a traditional priest, but to dedicate his life to those forgotten by the courts and the streets. He visited juvenile detention centers and halfway houses, sat across from boys who looked just like he once did, and said, "They'll try to define you by what they think you've done, but that's not who you are." In one session, a teenager asked him, "How did you not lose your mind?" Marcus paused and replied, "I almost did, but someone kept reminding me who I really was. That's what saved me. That's what I'm here to do now." His face, once printed on newspapers with bold accusations, now appeared on flyers for local outreach events. His voice, once silenced by concrete walls, became part of reform panels and restorative justice talks. But Marcus didn't care for attention. What he cared about was sitting quietly beside someone who felt unseen and simply saying, "I know." For Lila, seeing Marcus free wasn't enough. She kept pushing for police reform, working with legal clinics to train students on wrongful convictions. She never let the file go cold again. And every year on the anniversary of Marcus's release, they returned to that courtroom, not to relive the past, but to stand as a reminder: the truth is slow, but it can still arrive. In the months that followed, Lila returned to daily life, but nothing felt the same. Fighting for her brother's freedom had completely reshaped how she viewed concepts like success and stability. She left her job at a corporate law firm and became a teaching assistant at a public school on Chicago's South Side, the very neighborhood where she and Marcus had grown up. The courtroom might have freed her brother, but the work of justice had only just begun for her. Watching children grow up in an environment of violence, poverty, and racial bias, Lila realized that without early intervention, there would be more Marcuse's lost the system. She founded a scholarship fund called Project Elijah, named after Marcus's middle name, to help underprivileged students access quality education and offer free legal counseling to their families. It wasn't charity. It was defense against a system that too often punished the powerless. Her mission was clear: build a wall of knowledge where there once was silence. Each month, Lila traveled to different schools and housing complexes, hosting Know Your Rights workshops for teenagers. She taught them how to safely interact with police, how to recognize legal traps, and how to protect themselves from being misrepresented or silenced. The sessions weren't loud or dramatic. They were precise, urgent, and personal. Lila never saw herself as a hero, just a sister, a teacher, someone who once knew what it felt like to be completely powerless, and had promised herself no one else would feel that way alone again. On the one-year anniversary of Marcus's release, the monastery where he now lived held a community ceremony. Everyone who had walked with him through his journey was invited. Lila arrived quietly, holding the hand of an 8-year-old girl, a student from her school who had received the first scholarship from Project Elijah. The girl looked nervous, but when called to the stage, she stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. In a soft, shaking voice, she read her essay aloud. Who is my hero? She spoke about a man who had gone to prison for something he didn't do, and who came back not angry, but kind. She didn't know all the details, just what Ms. Lila had told her, but her words brought a hush over the room. People didn't cry because they were sad. They cried because the truth had traveled farther than they ever expected it to. From the back row, Marcus sat motionless until his shoulders shook. For the first time in years, he wept not from pain, but from meaning. He had lived through hell, but somehow it had become the soil for something good. He understood, in that quiet, trembling moment, that the worst thing ever done to him had become the reason another child believed in the goodness of people. Years later, the story of Marcus James was studied in law school classrooms as a definitive case of wrongful conviction. A documentary titled Until the Gavel Falls, chronicling the journey of Marcus and Lila, gained national recognition. It was used in university lectures, legal symposiums, and advocacy campaigns to raise awareness around criminal justice reform. But neither Marcus nor Lila cared for the spotlight. What mattered to them was something quieter. A young man who stayed in school because someone believed in him. A parent who walked into a legal clinic for the first time because they'd seen Lila speak on TV. A prison counselor who began holding book clubs after watching Marcus tell his story in a church basement. These were the victories that couldn't be measured in headlines. Because in the end, justice isn't just about overturning a sentence. It's about healing. It's about rebuilding what was torn down, restoring what was buried, and planting something new where trust had been stolen. For Marcus, freedom wasn't the finish line. It was the promise of purpose. And for Lila, it was a light she carried forward, one step, one student, one truth at a time. The story of Marcus and Lila is not just about a wrongful conviction. It's about the power of persistence, the weight of silence, and the light that can grow from the darkest places. It reminds us that justice isn't automatic. It takes people willing to speak, to stand, and to believe even when no one else will. Thank you for listening to this journey. If this story moved you, helped you see the world differently, or simply reminded you of the importance of truth, please consider supporting this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice matters. Your attention matters. And together, stories like these won't be forgotten.